Hello, everybody. Over the last 24 hours, important diplomatic things took place that I would like to discuss with you about the situation in the Ukraine war. There was a meeting in Saudi Arabia again, this time between highest representatives of the US and the Ukrainian side. And what I then read this morning as I opened the newspapers is this news here that Ukraine has apparently agreed, Mr. Zelensky has agreed to accepting a 30-day ceasefire deal with the Americans. Now, this will come as something strange to both camps because on the one side the Europeans and the the Europeans, the Ukrainians, the Americans for the longest time have said the only acceptable ceasefire and ending to the war is a full withdrawal of Russian forces from all Ukrainian territory, including from Crimea, and then reparation payments, and finally war criminal trials against Vladimir Putin and other Russians. And now we are in a situation where the Ukrainians are saying we are ready for a ceasefire. Also, like considering that what happened 2 weeks ago in the White House, that comes as a surprise to the Europeans. And on the other hand, it comes as a surprise to the Russians, who for the longest time have said we rule out any kind of ceasefire, even while we negotiate toward a settlement of the Ukraine affair, right? They've said we will not give up our position of military strength. So that now this is big news in the West. And you go to BBC, you go to CNN, CBS, and so on. They're full with this news over here. But if you go to, let's say, the Russian side, I haven't found so far yet any talk on Russia Today or on Sputnik about these supposed ceasefire offer from Ukraine. The Russian media, at least the ones that I have access to in English, are so far relatively silent about this. But what they do talk about is the fact that in the last 48 hours, Moscow was the victim of a Ukrainian attack, right? That several drones hit Moscow, and that two or three people died, and that apartment buildings were blown up. That is the news at the moment in for on the Russian side, right? Ukrainian drone attack on Russia. This is what's occupying them, but the West right now is occupied with thinking about this breaking news that Zelensky said we can have a ceasefire. Now, there's a lot to say about this, and I would like to go through this with you in order to make sense of the overall situation that we're in and the apparent approach that the Americans are now trying to implement in their grand strategic game toward Europe and Russia, because I think this is very significant. First of all, what needs to be noted is that this agreement between the US and Ukraine was not actually negotiated with Volodymyr Zelensky. Mr. Zelensky was not present at the negotiations. Who was responsible for this was the top leadership of the foreign policy world of the US. I mean, Mr. Trump was also not part of the negotiation team, but obviously he sent his team to negotiate something that the Ukrainians in the beginning didn't want to do. The people responsible were the five that you can see here on this picture. The most important from the US side is, of course, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the guy here in the left, and then so with in the red tie, right? And then you have also National Security Advisor Mike Waltz here to his left standing, and on the Ukrainian side, the main negotiator, also from the way the picture is set up, is the man in the middle, Mr. Andrei Yermak, who is his official title is Ukrainian head of the presidential office. He is Mr. Zelensky's right hand, and also somebody who's talked about as a potential replacement for Mr. Zelensky in the future. You then also had Andrei Shibia. I'm sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he's the current foreign minister of Ukraine, and you have Rustem Umerov, the Ukrainian defense minister. So also on the Ukrainian side, the cabinet level top decision makers and the military, the civilian head of the Ukrainian military, who are sitting there now. Mr. Zelensky himself, he obviously also wanted to have something to say about this because he was actually also in Saudi Arabia, but as I understand it, he was in Riyadh, not in Jeddah, where this was negotiated, and he I thought this was his office here, from where he then did this video communication that he accepts and is willing to offer a ceasefire for 30 days. It also might be a hotel room in Riyadh, or he already flew back. But he was in Saudi Arabia at the same time as his negotiation team was there in Jeddah, which also tells you a lot about his current standing. I mean, Mr. Zelensky is now really. It's questionable whether he ever has been in charge of Ukraine, but even now, even more so, it's getting more and more obvious that being in the same country where some of very sensitive issues are being negotiated about, you're not being invited to the actual talks. That is a sign of complete and utter weakness. Now, what we need to appreciate about what came out of last night's negotiations in Saudi Arabia is what was published by these two sides. And what was published is a joint statement between the United States and Ukraine. So this is the diplomatic outcome document, and it's not a big document. It's a small document. This is how one of the indications we have that this is actually a negotiated outcome of the last 8 hours. You know, this was on the table, probably literally, and people were taking notes and hammering out the actual wording of each of these paragraphs. It's not long. It's basically 1 page, 1.5 page max, right? A couple of paragraphs, and the everything that is in here would be subject to very strong negotiations between the two parties. Was one more indication that we have for this not being a pre-arranged agreement, you know, that basically you already had hammered out in previous negotiations and then just meet in order to sign, is that we lack a lot of the convoluted diplomatic language. The only real diplomatic, like, little preamble that they usually put in is this one here, and it is very, very straightforward. Today in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, under the gracious hospitality of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the United States and Ukraine took important steps toward restoring durable peace for Ukraine. And just before I continue, I want to say that this agreement was published on the homepage here of the State Department of the US, and it was also published by the Ukrainians at the Ukrainian side. So what we know about this is now the working agreement of Washington and Kiev about how to continue with whatever's going to happen next. That's why this is really important. Let's continue. Representatives of both nations praised the bravery of the Ukrainian people in defense of their nation and agreed that now is the time to begin a process toward lasting peace. The Ukrainian delegation reiterated the Ukrainian people's strong gratitude to President Trump, the US Congress, and the people of the United States for making possible meaningful progress toward peace. What is really interesting about these two paragraphs is that, on the one hand, the Ukrainians obviously insisted that their bravery is being acknowledged in this document. On the other hand, the United States really drove home the point that now you have to be grateful. And remembering what happened 2 weeks ago when Donald Trump gave Zelensky a dressing down in the White House, this is obviously the reaction to that. The Ukrainians saying, like, we are very thankful to you. Thank you for everything you did. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We put it in writing that we're thankful. While on the other hand, the Americans agreed to recognize Ukraine's bravery. What I also find interesting is that this wording here, that now is the time to begin a process toward lasting peace. So this basically invalidates all of the talk of Ukraine from before, that they were trying to look for peace, right? Which is only now they are willing to start to begin the process toward lasting peace, right? So it means before there was no process for lasting peace. Whether this was is an intended meaning or not, I don't know, but it's interesting that this is in there. But let's continue with the document. Ukraine expressed readiness to accept the US proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which can be extended by mutual agreement of the parties and which is subject to acceptance and concurrent implementation by the Russian Federation. Now, this is the core of what this document proposes and what the agreement between Ukraine and the United States is: a 30-day ceasefire. So not an unended ceasefire, a limited one, 1 month, but immediate And it's also important to note that this is a US proposal, so this is definitely not what the Ukrainians started with. At least not, I don't think so, because they actually wanted much more, but we'll talk about this in a second. Um, the the other point is also it's not unconditional. I've seen some reports on by commentators, some saying that this now amounts to a Ukrainian capitulation, and I've seen others which said this is an unconditional surrender, right? And this is not an unconditional surrender, not at all. This is merely a proposal to stop the shooting for 30 days. Now, by implication, and this is why the Russians have been saying so far they will not agree to a ceasefire, by implication, if you stop the shooting, what you do is you freeze the conflict at the current contact line, right? If you do not shoot, if you do not move anymore militarily, forcefully, then the whatever happens on the battlefield stops, right? So this is a offer by the US and Ukraine to stop moving the front lines. Now the problem is, of course, that the Russians are on the winning side. They are moving toward in Kursk and also inside the four oblasts. They're gaining territory day by day. So the offer here is for toward Russia. How about you stop winning on the battlefield? Which is why the Russians are obviously said so far that they're not willing to contemplate this. But there's more to say about this. Um, it's also that it's not unconditional because it rests on the implementation by the Russian Federation. So this is now shifting the responsibility to move forward toward a ceasefire to Russia. And again, Russia has said they rule it out. But let's see what happens here. Let's continue reading and then again think about the different implications. The United States will communicate to Russia that Russian reciprocity is the key to achieving peace. The United States will immediately lift the pause on intelligence sharing and resume security assistance to Ukraine. This is also super important. So this establishes that the United States is now the mediator to mediate between Russia and Ukraine, which is very bizarre, thinking about the fact that this is a proxy war between the US and Russia, that now the US inserts itself and basically makes itself the mediator in this conflict looks very weird. On the other hand, what this also establishes is that you now have the basis for direct negotiations between the main parties of the proxy war. Although for Russia, of course, it was not a proxy war. It was an immediate war, but for the US, it was a proxy war. And the US, of course, for the longest time said itself, we are not part of the war. We're not a war party. We're not a war party. We're just supporting. We're just helping Ukraine. And that's why for the longest part of the last 3 years, the US was saying any kind of negotiations need to be negotiations between Russia and Ukraine because we are not part of the war. I mean, everything needs to go to Ukraine. Ukraine needs to be at the table. Ukraine needs to be at the table, blah, 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 blah. The last 3 years. Now, this does away with that. This establishes that it is the United States and it is Moscow, Russia, that are the chief parties and in charge of the negotiations, and that the Ukrainians now officially signed off on that. That's the importance of this part, saying that, fine, okay, Ukraine accepts that the US will negotiate on its behalf without it being present, and this will appear further down below again, the Europeans aren't going to be there either. So this is the official agreement that now peace talks will move between the United States and Russia. So in a way, this is the US like uh, shortening the leash of its proxy, right? Which Donald Trump several times said in the past, Ukraine is harder to deal with than Russia. So this is them dealing with Ukraine and establishing again who's the dominant power and who's the satellite, who's the proxy and who's in charge. On the other hand, obviously, what the United States had to give the Ukrainians in order to establish this, and that is the second part, that now there will be security assistance again, but intelligence sharing. So security assistance and intelligence sharing. So the this is highly interesting, of course, because it doesn't say what kind of security assistance. It doesn't make any promises. There's no promise of weapons deliveries. And you remember the last 3 years, there were constantly weapon packages on the table, and constantly the US then giving more and more weapons, or strong arming the Europeans, or convincing the Europeans to give more weapons from their side, and so on and so forth. Nothing of that. Nothing. The only concrete thing that the Ukrainians get in return is a promise that the previously implemented pause on intelligence sharing is going to be lifted. And this intelligence sharing is, of course, what they need in order to operate a lot of the US weaponry that they still have at the moment, right? The HIMARS and so on. So the only the only thing in return they really got is that they have now again the guarantee that the minimum requirement in order to continue the war, if Russia doesn't say, okay, fine, we continue, is if Russia says, like, fine, we agree to the ceasefire, if they don't agree, then the only promise that Ukraine got in return is that they again get the minimum they need in order to have somewhat of a military chance on the battlefield. Somewhat, I say, because so far, again, it's not going in their favor. Um, the security assistance, again, we don't know anything concrete about the security assistance, and nothing is promised. This document promises almost nothing from the US side, while strong arming Ukraine into accepting that if the Russians are on board with the US idea, that they will actually stop the fighting, that they will do as the US tells them. Let me just show you what else is in this document, and then we discuss what's not in there. The delegations also discussed the importance of humanitarian relief efforts as part of the peace process, particularly during the above-mentioned ceasefire, including the exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilian detainees, and the return of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. On the one hand, this paragraph doesn't promise that anything will be done by the US side, right? It says that the delegations discussed the importance. This is not a promise. This is just putting into writing that this was part of the discussion. It's just part of the protocol, but there's no promise. So humanitarian relief efforts are going to be important, and the exchange of prisoners are going to be important, and the release of civilian detainees. And these are non-controversial things. Prisoner of war exchange is something that also Russia is interested in. Release of civilian detainees is something that also Russia is interested in, and that is a natural kind of place where usually mediating states, like the United States portrays itself here as a mediating state, right? That mediators usually do, and this can be in the interest of both parties. So this is not controversial at all, and the return of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. This is a Ukrainian talking point, but fine. I mean, it's in there. It's obviously not something that is something that can be mentioned. And again, this is the US didn't even promise that it would bring this up, but the this is just the protocol of what happened. The US didn't even promise to use this as negotiation strategies. Didn't promise to bring this up with the Russians. It's really just a protocol. Both delegations agreed to name their negotiating teams and immediately begin negotiations toward an enduring peace that provides for Ukraine's long-term security. The United States committed to discuss these specific proposals with representatives from Russia. The Ukrainian delegation reiterated that European partners shall be involved in the process. This is, again, is fantastic. The wording is really important. The Ukrainian delegation reiterated that the European partners shall be involved. Again, this is the United States doesn't actually promise anything. They don't promise that the Europeans would be included. On the contrary, this indicates that the US point was that the Europeans should not be included. And in order to sweeten this agreement with the Ukrainians just a little bit, they said, okay, let's mention it. Let's mention it in our agreement that this is your point. This is your standpoint, and that you try to bring that through. But we, the US, we are not going to commit to anything. So this is the Ukrainians accepting, actually, that the US might and will not include the Europeans in the discussions with Russia about Ukraine and Europe. This is really very strong. Also, that okay, now the discussions will begin. Okay, fine, on what to do then after the ceasefire, or how to use the ceasefire in order to get to an enduring peace that provides for Ukraine's long-term security. Do you remember how important, how wedded the Ukrainians were to this point that they want security agreements? And there is no security agreements in this document. The only place where security is mentioned is in this part of the agreement, which just says that, okay, now negotiations will start toward enduring peace for including the security of Ukraine. No security guarantees. Security guarantees are off the table. The Americans made it very, very clear that they will not provide security agreements, and that NATO membership is also off the table. It doesn't mention NATO. Doesn't mention NATO at all. Uh, even more stunning, right? From the viewpoint of what the last 3 years were about. So security guarantees are not a condition anymore for Ukraine to agree to anything. What the document establishes is that the goal is Ukrainian security, and but that is actually something the Russians also already said. The goal is a framework for mutual security on the European continent. So a lot in this document is formulated and phrased in a way that it is actually not obviously going against Russian interests, at least on the level of how this thing is phrased. The biggest problem for the Russians is, again, that they're currently winning on the battlefield, and if they agree to this, then they're basically risking throwing away their military advantage. But this is on a different level, right? This is the military level, like purely on the level of what is codified in here. What we've got a complete utter change in the way that the US treats Ukraine, and in the way that the US is now is establishing itself as the only power in the relationship to set the terms of what they are willing to negotiate about with the Russians. So far, the only thing the Ukrainians are getting in return for agreeing to the US negotiating on their behalf is the promise of intelligence sharing happening again. Last paragraph here. Lastly, both countries' presidents agreed to conclude as soon as possible a comprehensive agreement for developing Ukraine's critical mineral resources to expand Ukraine's economy and guarantee Ukraine's long-term prosperity and security. This is the mineral deal. The mineral deal is back. The Americans, Donald Trump, obviously still wants to be paid for the last 3 years. Still wants to be paid back for the loans, for the monetary investments that they made. They don't want Ukrainian useless, worthless paper money. They want the minerals, the things that's in the ground, something that will help them with their industry. So I think, again, this is a very bad deal for the Ukrainians. They connected, of course, on their side with prosperity and security, which is something already the last deal tried to do. But overall, this is just the willingness of the Ukrainians to actually pay the United States in mineral wealth for whatever is gonna come next. Again, also here, there's no concrete promises in this document. It's really quite striking to me that we have here a truce effort, but with no security guarantees for Ukraine. So this is the central point is gone now from the Ukrainian side, and the US now has a free hand basically in negotiating with Russia. On the other hand, this now puts a very heavy strain on Russia, and we need to keep in mind that this is happening in the context of the largest attack on Moscow since the war began. And I myself, I don't believe very much in coincidences. This is not a coincidence. There is timing behind this, but there are two possible explanations for what the timing means. On the one hand, if you are a cynic, you might say that these attacks on Moscow are coordinated with the Americans in order to send a very strong signal to Moscow to threaten them and say, like, look, where this is coming from, there's more in store. You're not out of the woods. You better agree to this ceasefire, or you will suffer even more. You know, the big stick to the carrot. And that this is coordinated in order to coincide basically with the talks in Saudi Arabia. I think this is an option, but I actually interpret it differently, which is what often happens in peace processes. So this is, whatever you think of this is definitely the Americans trying in one way or another to come to a peace. Obviously, a peace that is beneficial to the United States, but it is an approach to reestablish um, peaceful interactions, right, in Europe. And one of the problems that you have is usually that there are minor factions, the war factions, the hawks, on in any one of these camps that try to sabotage this. And this could have been a sabotage effort from the hawks, the war hawks in Ukraine, to try to preemptively create military facts on the ground to attack Moscow, so as to make it impossible for Moscow to agree to anything that might come out of Riyadh, to just double down on military efforts and therefore sabotage any kind of fragile move towards the diplomacy instead of military. Because let's not forget, there is a good part of Ukrainians, of war hawks, of right-wing nationalist war hawks who want to continue fighting, and who would still want to drag the United States and the Europeans into a much larger war and thereby win over Russia, even at the expense, even at the threat of nuclear exchange, right? So there's still that strain of people there, and on the American side, we also have such people who are still present. Although the fact that these attacks were done with drones and not with missiles tells me that this was much more under Ukrainian control than, let's say, had HIMARS or sorry, HIMARS don't fly that far, but had missiles being used in order to hit Moscow, right? This was drone technology, which to a good extent might be under the complete control of the Ukrainians. They might not actually need the Americans for this, but obviously this is a large-scale operation and this is a prepared operation. You cannot pull something like this off just overnight. This has been prepared for a while, and the timing with which this came is most likely not a coincidence. It's also because this serves no direct military purpose on the battlefield, right? This is really just terrorizing civilians in Russia. So this is very much a political statement by whoever coordinated this. But it would surprise me if this wasn't signed off from people even like Zelensky, or at least the Minister of Defense, because this is a very consequential step, right? So while the Minister of Defense of Ukraine is negotiating in Jeddah, his underlings then were just previously involved in doing this. Now, what I want to get to is that, of course, what this does is it strengthens the resolve in Russians to keep on fighting. Now, the BBC in this little piece here, they're talking about Mr. Zelensky and the negotiations here in Saudi Arabia. Again, this is big news, right? Then they go to these attacks in Russia and they show people and interview them. What do you think? And they do this, with like this little. You can feel the joy in the reporters, like, oh, Russians thought they were invincible and now they're learning they're not invincible. Ha ha ha. This BBC is such a stupid. They're stupid people. And in any way, like what the interview here reveals is, of course, that the Russians only say like, oh, we have to hit them stronger. This man says like we should just hit them back harder, should hit Kiev harder. So this actually these attacks harden the resolve of Russians to gain what they want on the battlefield. It doesn't weaken the resolve, right? And this is what the hardliners in Kiev might exactly want to provoke. They want to make sure that Russians are not willing to attempt a diplomatic route with them. They want to make sure that the only way out is a military is the continuation of military confrontation. This sounds illogical, especially if you think about Ukraine losing the war. But again, this is the people who think that if we just double down harder and if we just bring in NATO and bring in maybe even a nuclear exchange, then we can still win. Such people exist in all and any wars. This is people in Japan in the Second World War. There was those who still wanted to continue fighting even after the nuclear bombs. So the peace faction inside Tokyo had to subdue those people and win over against them. And this kind of struggle is now obviously also going on inside Ukraine, because this is not a done deal. On no side is this a done deal. What we might appreciate is that that this agreement now establishes that overall Ukraine is not going to be at the table, at the negotiating table between Russia and Moscow. And as I understand it, Marco Rubio is now either on the way to Moscow or to negotiate with the Russians somewhere, or to be in touch with the Russians. So now the Americans are taking this to Russia, and we have no statement so far. I'm speaking to you at around noon on March 12th in Japan. So far, we have no statement, to my knowledge, from either um, um, Vladimir Putin nor Russian statements to any extent. Of course, because it's 6 a.m. right now in Russia, or slightly after. So this will probably come out within a day or two. The Russian media at the moment, again, it's the dead of night or it's very early morning, does not report on Saudi Arabia so far and the negotiations there. The Russians seem to be in waiting at the moment. And this is a smart thing to do, obviously. You want to have all the information necessary, and obviously the Americans are now going to brief the Russians on what happened and on their negotiation position. The this very dishonest European media, The Guardian, is reporting that overnight there were attacks on Kiev and Kharkiv hours after Ukraine says it is ready to accept the ceasefire. You know, already spinning this story as if though the continuation of the attacks, the continuation of the military confrontation is a sign of Russia basically throwing away the ceasefire plan or being dishonest about it. Although obviously the Russians have not made up their minds, and as long as you don't have made up your mind, actually what's happening on the battlefield, the military operation, obviously continues, for as bad as it is. But it obviously continues. But you can already see how they're trying to frame that. And actually, the Americans set themselves up for that corner as well, because Marco Rubio, in one statement about this agreement with Ukraine, said that the ball is now in the court of the Russians, and if they don't agree to the ceasefire, then we know who is the obstacle to peace. So basically threatening Russia that they need to accept this, otherwise the Americans will spin back to their previous position. From the Russian side, again, there's just a lot to consider here, because yes, while on the one hand they're winning on the battlefield and they've made it clear that they're not willing to sacrifice to give this up. On the other hand, it is an agreement for 30 days. There is now, pardon me, there is now an option that maybe through a diplomatic approach with the Americans, the Russians might get what they want. Because at the end of the day, it is clear Russia never wanted to occupy all of Ukraine. That's not the goal. The goal of the Russians is to have a comprehensive security agreement for the European and larger Eurasian security structure in order to be safe in their own region. Now, they if the Americans offer something that works toward that, and if they manage to demilitarize Ukraine, and if they manage to make sure Ukraine never joins NATO and doesn't get any form of such like similar security agreement, and if they manage to change the government in Ukraine to something that is somebody that's more friendly to the Russians, then then you don't actually need to win anymore on the battlefield. Oh, and the fourth part, of course, if the Ukrainians then are willing to give up the four oblasts and sign over Crimea, right? If all of this can be achieved actually at the negotiating table with the Americans, then there is no good reason anymore to continue the special military operation. So the important part for me here is that this agreement is not an unended. This is not a cessation of hostilities completely. This is a cessation of hostilities for 30 days. So I think this was a clever move by the Americans to basically offer something of a limited term to the Russians and say, why not try it out? If 30 days are not enough for Ukraine to dig in any reasonable way, um, to refortify anything. It can refortify a couple of positions, yes, but this is not enough to structurally win and create the military industrial base that Ukraine would need in order to continue fighting, right? So this would be a limited investment from the military's point of view of Russia. If they took it and said, let's see where this goes, these 30 days, maybe we can actually get to the point we want to, because the Americans are now establishing that this is the minimum they expect. They expect that the Russians take this, which, of course, again, by implication, means to to freeze the battle lines where they are, which, especially when it comes to Kursk, is something that I can hardly imagine the Russians willing to do, to this pre-February 2022 Russian territory, then still being occupied by the Ukrainians. And basically the Ukrainians, while they are losing Kursk, and it's only a matter of weeks now until Kursk would be completely cleaned out, that they then make this actually a bargaining chip of the Ukrainians, right? So something that I could imagine is that the Russians say, like, sure, we might agree to 30 days on Ukrainian on the territory of the four oblasts, but not in Kursk region. That this might be part of the negotiations that are going to take place in the next 1 or 2 days. It's also possible that Russia actually says, like, no, we will not do this, and we have like strong indications for that, right? There is in Russian media, also even in English translation, the Russian hardliner Sergei Karaganov, who says Russia must not fall into Trump's honey trap, and says, like, no, even if they offer us all these sweet goodies and say like they're on our side and would like to help us, we must not believe them. We must establish with military means. What the realities on the European continent are going to look like. Yeah, but Karaganov is Karaganov, and Vladimir Putin. I mean, these two men do have. Vladimir Putin does take Karaganov's advice into account. We don't know if he will go for it or not. What we do know is that the Russians will be highly skeptical toward that, and that this, if the Russians say yes to this, it would be a huge step forward from their side. That's what we would have to interpret it as, because the European media makes it look as if though it was Mr. Zelensky who's taking a leap of faith and agreeing to the unacceptable, when in fact what this does is basically making freezing a conflict that they are clearly, utterly, completely, totally losing. And there's just no question about it. And I mean, military question about it. Of course, the European media tries to to portray the opposite as being the case, and just one more HIMAR and then Moscow will fall, right? That's the image that they're still portraying. But in reality, what this is telling the Russians, we want you to stop winning. And the Russians would have every reason to refuse that. On the other hand, there would also be a lot of reasons to at least try. And again, I would wish that the dying stops, and it stops quickly, and that it stops comprehensively. And the intriguing thing from the Russian point, I would argue, is that now you have a new option on the table, right? It's not only the military option. Now, diplomacy might lead to something that you wish for. It's then, of course, a question also of verifiability, this can be, whether the Russians can somehow verify that what's being agreed on is then also being done, because the Russians have been lied to time and again. And of course, Vladimir Putin remembers that. He remembers the last 20 years, 25 years of negotiating with the Americans, and of the backstabbing about Ukraine, about Georgia, about a lot of these hot topic issues. And on the other hand, still, Russia does need some form of way to end the fighting, right? You don't want to keep sending your own people, your own men into this battlefield and have them slaughtered. Even if the death toll is not as high as the Europeans tried to make us believe, you still have a price to pay. And the Russian economy might do better if the Americans lifted sanctions and if normalization of ties would be achieved. And you have a lot to gain from peace. So in this sense, if now peace negotiations are on the table, that is something that shouldn't be, and apparently right now is not, rejected outwardly by the Russians. the the question really will hinge upon what the Americans are willing to offer to the Russians now in the direct talks with them, and whether a comprehensive security agreement is actually also on the table. And there's right now very little that the Europeans and the Ukrainians can do. I mean, of course, they could try to militarily continue disrupting this process, but this document here now establishes dominance of the US over its Ukrainian proxy, and it excludes again of more or less officially the Europeans, because the Europeans are really just a side, literally just a side note here, like just a remark at like toward the end of the document that okay, we will take into account that the Europeans still exist. Yeah, this is great power politics. It is public diplomacy. It's a very strange form of public diplomacy. It's strange that this is being done in such a public way, but this is a maybe a consequence of this entire war having been so publicly propagandized on all sides, and that the approach of Donald Trump in order to force the other parties into agreeing with him goes through the public eye. Whether the Russians will actually agree to this, agree partially, or even be willing to work with it, we will only know in a couple of hours or days from now. There are reasons to believe that this could be the first real diplomatic way forward ever since Istanbul in 2022. Who knows? Maybe something will come out of it. Time will tell. Thank you, everybody.